Hi, fantasy readers. This is Karyne Norton, your fellow bookbinger, and you are listening to the Finding Fantasy Reads podcast, where you can test out a new fantasy story every single week to find your next favorite author. Last week, we left off with a Cinderella retelling from Sarah Carlisle, and today we'll be finishing the story so we can close out our fantasy retelling month. So if you haven't listened to that first episode yet, you'll want to go back, because I'm about to mention a really big spoiler. And now I'm stalling in case some of you are fumbling to hit the pause button and avoid hearing the spoiler. All right, the rest of you will remember that we left off with a proposal from Sowell to Ellery. I'm guessing you're all eager to hear what she says. So, without further ado, please enjoy Unmasked, Part 2 by Sarah Carlisle. Chapter 6. But she hesitated. But he waited patiently. Thoughts chased each other through Ellery's head. Of course she loved Sowell. She always had. But did she love Sowell the way a woman loved a man? The memory of seeing Sowell shirtless in the woods, staining his shirt red and getting stung with nettles because she loved strawberries and he wanted to surprise her, suddenly came to her mind. Her face heated at the memory. It wasn't just seeing his broad chest and strong muscles, but also the thoughtfulness and care, and the willingness to be hurt on her behalf, that struck her. Hadn't she been on the verge of kissing him in the woods? Sowell's eyes were on hers, dark and serious, and she thought she could read a longing in them. And then, she knew. Their friendship had always been destined for this. He had so thoroughly entwined himself in her heart that she hadn't even realized it. Yes, she had always loved Sowell, but that love had delved deeper, creating a bond between them that she had barely noticed until now. No wonder she had suddenly found herself jealous of every pretty girl he interacted with. She wanted him for herself, not just as her friend, but as her husband and true love. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I'll marry you. Wait. Fear struck her, and she pulled back. But Sowell, my parents, if they're still here, they'll be at the ball. If you announce an engagement at the ball, they'll intercede, and I'm still underage. That's why I don't intend to announce an engagement at the ball. He switched to Ellery's log and put an arm around her, pulling her close. I intend to announce a wedding. Isn't that what an engagement is? He shook his head. I intend to marry you at the ball. Ellery laughed. You're teasing me. I'm not. I'll arrange it with the priest in advance. I will announce that I have chosen my bride, but not an engagement, a wedding. I will declare that I have chosen my bride and that we will wed then and there, and that the ball goers will have the delight of witnessing our wedding ceremony. They'll be thrilled, and it will be far harder for your parents to protest with the excitement of the crowd. And on what grounds would they protest? They want to send you to be a lady-in-waiting rather than let you marry a prince? They'd be shouted down by everyone excited to see a wedding. Ellery nodded slowly. It could work. Perhaps. The idea was outrageous. Was it possible? When Sowell spoke, he painted a beautiful picture. But there were so many things that could go wrong. What if her parents saw her before Sowell could start his announcement? They could remove her before there was time to create the right feeling in the crowd that would protect her. And how could she go, when her only position at the palace was as a maid? But where would I get a dress? I can't arrange with a seamstress or go to fittings as a maid, and I dare not go as Lady Ellery. Sowell tilted his head, considering. I will speak with Marin, he said. The two of you are almost the same size. If she will stand in for you for fittings, and perhaps request a dress that is not too fitted, then perhaps we can get something that is close enough, and you can make the small adjustments needed in the evenings. And we'll make it a masked ball, so your parents won't know you're there until the announcement. More work after she had cleaned grates all day. Would her fingers even obey her? But if they could make this work, then Aleri could marry Sawol, and she could go by her real name again. She wouldn't have to hide. Losing a few hours of sleep and pricking her aching fingers would be worth it to be safe and happy with Sawol forever. Very well. Now it was her turn to wrap her arms around his. After his romantic declaration and her interrupted one, she owed him reassurance of her own affections. I would be thrilled to marry you, she said, loving the slow grin that crept across his face and turned it from handsome to gorgeous. I love you. It took me, too, a long time to realize it wasn't just friendship. I think we got so used to a certain kind of love that it took us both by surprise. But when I look at my heart, I realize you're already there, nestled in close. I love you, Sawol. Marrying you will be happiness come true. His lips descended on hers, and she wrapped her arms around the back of his neck to pull him close as they shared their first kiss. It was dim, and her bottom hurt from sitting on rough wood after working hard all day, but even that discomfort couldn't ruin the perfection of the moment for her. His kiss was gentle, tender, but warm and eager, and she smiled into his kiss with how right and perfect it felt. She could feel him smiling back, and then she burst into delighted laughter and tucked her face into his neck in embarrassment. I love you, he whispered. I love you too. They couldn't stay in their little hidden corner forever. While it wasn't likely that any servants would come by this time of day, they couldn't be sure, and Sawol had to dress for dinner besides. But their whispered promises would have to do until the ball. I'll find you when I can. Sawol cupped her cheek in his hand. I'll tell Marin where you are, and have her speak to you about the dress. Your parents are unlikely to watch her as closely, and I can trust her to keep the secret. Aleri bit her lip, but nodded. She didn't know Marin quite as well as Sawol did, of course, as his sister was 4 years younger than them. But she would trust him to know his sister. I will see you at the ball, she said. She stepped forward into his arms for one last tight hug before she picked up her pails and turned back towards the kitchen. Now she only had to avoid the notice of her parents, get a dress made for the ball, and transform back from maid Eva to Lady Aleri just in time to wed the prince. It would hardly be easy, but marrying Sawol would be infinitely worth it. Marin dropped into the chair in Sawol's sitting room, looking dazed. Here? The whole time? She asked. Cleaning? Sawol nodded. It was worth it to escape her parents and their plan. I don't question that, but the poor girl is cleaning grates? You could have told me earlier, and perhaps I could have taken her on as my personal maid. She frowned. Or perhaps not. Stepmother wouldn't want me getting rid of her spy. She's better off away from the family anyway, Sawol pointed out. If she was your maid, she would be seen more regularly by those who might recognize her, given more time. Marin nodded ruefully. Like me, and the brothers. I suppose it's awful to admit that I don't take particular notice of the maids. There must be 100 servants at the palace. At least. It makes for a good hiding place. Marin cocked her head. And I would imagine that you never planned to tell me either, which means you have some scheme in mind. She leaned forward, her face lit with interest. Tell me. Sawol stifled a laugh. I want her to attend the ball. Ball? Father plans to have a ball to introduce me to the young ladies of society. You don't just want her there to dance. Marin tapped her chin. You're thinking to, what, present her as your choice there? Won't her parents protest? That's why I plan to do more than that. I plan to marry her at the ball. He explained, to Marin's gasps and chuckles of amusement, exactly how he hoped it would go. I'd be happy to work with my seamstress on an extra dress, Marin said at last. My presentation isn't for a month, but stepmother has had 2 seamstresses making extra gowns for me for the past 3 months. Adding an additional one shouldn't be any trouble. Sowell impulsively hugged her. Marin's eyes went wide, but she hugged him tight back. They had never been a family to hug or kiss much. He and his brothers were more likely to slap backs or shoulders, with or without swords. Thank you, he said. I am happy to help. I've always liked Larry, and now I'm sure I'll love her. Not as much as you do, she added slyly, but enough that I cannot wait to welcome her as my sister. My first sister. It's odd to think I could have as many as 7 someday. More if stepmother has children with father. Sowell frowned at the thought. I believe she's young enough. But perhaps it wouldn't be such a bad thing. If Queen Shined had a child or 2 to keep her busy, she might be less demanding of Marin. You know, he said, you don't always have to try to please the queen. I sometimes think she withholds her praise just to keep you dancing her tune. Marin turned away. Father expects her to mold me into a proper lady. He flicked her shoulder. You're a proper lady as you are, and an excellent princess. He stood. Thank you again, Marin, from both of us. You're welcome. Oh, and don't worry, I'll make sure to have shoes, underclothes, jewelry, and all of that ready for Larry, too. He stared blankly at her. Shoes. Right, I suppose she would need those. Laughing, Marin shook her head and waved as she hurried off. Now, the only trouble would be figuring out how Marin would get the gown, and shoes, apparently, to Larry on the day of the ball. Marin's maid couldn't be trusted, which would make for an interesting challenge. It was a good thing Sowell rather liked a challenge. You, maid! Larry froze in her tracks in shock at being addressed so imperiously from such a familiar voice. She looked up to see Princess Marin standing in the hallway just outside her bedroom. Yes, Your Highness? She asked with a curtsy. I want you to deliver this to Lady L. Immediately. Marin held out a paper-wrapped parcel, and Larry blinked for a moment before she realized what the younger girl was about. Yes, Your Highness. She left her buckets and went to take the package. Good luck, Marin whispered softly, squeezing Larry's fingers for a brief moment before releasing the package. Thank you for everything, Larry said before going back to her pails. A thrill ran down her spine, and it took everything she had to slip into a servant's passage to leave the pails before she rushed up the servant's stairs to reach her room. She couldn't wait to see how the dress had turned out. Thankfully, she still had water in her basin, as she needed to scrub the soot from her hands and arms before she dared open the package. But finally, she tugged open the string and let the paper fall onto her bed. Oh, she whispered, spreading the dress across her bed. It was as bright and lovely as a summer's day, with its shimmering golden bodice and skirt, the sleeves mere suggestions in a pale filmy material that was almost translucent. She had worn gowns just as beautiful when she was Lady Illyri, especially when she had been at court. But after spending almost 2 months in a servant's uniform and apron, it seemed the most beautiful dress she had ever seen. A pair of simple, delicate sandals, long white gloves, a full masquerade mask of a creamy white, and the proper undergarments peeked out of the package. Marin had thought of everything. Thank you, Marin, she whispered. She had to get back to work, and quickly, before she was missed. But she couldn't help one last glance at the beautiful gown on her way out, and as she knelt before grate after grate, she smiled at the sunshine-bright feeling she had when she thought of it. It was little sacrifice to work on the dress that evening, despite her exhaustion after the day's work. Sowell had been right. Marin's size was very close to Illyri's, and she probably could have gotten away without making any adjustments at all. But she tucked and arranged a little, partly for the perfect fit, but partly so that she could hang on to some control over her future. Sowell was arranging the wedding, Marin had provided the dress, and Alary had done nothing but hide as a maid. Fixing her dress was at least some small contribution she could make to what she hoped would be the best day of her life. The next day seemed endless. Her hands ached from scrubbing so fast that she accidentally scoured her fingers a few times, and her back ached from stooping. It was a good thing she would be wearing long gloves at the ball to hide her scraped fingers and calloused palms. Alary was grinning as she returned to her room at the end of the day. Tonight was the ball. So far, she had managed to avoid her parents. She trusted that Sowell was arranging things for the wedding, and just after midnight, she would be wed to her best friend and the love of her life. She opened her door and froze, stunned. The yellow gown was no more. Torn scraps of the sunny color were scattered around the room, hanging forlornly from the knob of her dresser and picking up dust on the floor. A cry lodged in Alary's throat, but she couldn't make a sound. She couldn't even release her painfully tight grip on the doorknob as she stared in horrified confusion at the mess that had once been her dress. "What happened here?" a voice said from behind. Finally unfrozen, Alary whirled to see Nesta standing just behind her, looking over her shoulder at the disaster that had been her ball gown. My, Nesta said, shaking her head and tisking. "I hope that wasn't intended to be a ball gown, Eva. Proper servants do not attend balls given by their betters. In fact, if you were reported to be attempting a tryst with a nobleman at the ball, it would be perfectly justified if one of the other servants decided to prevent such a reckless, immoral behavior. Not, of course, that you would ever imagine such a thing, of course." She laughed. "How could you? The king and queen would recognize a servant as an impostor the moment she tried to enter the ballroom." Nesta spun on her heel and was gone before Alary could say a word. That rat! That ridiculous, pompous, self-important ogress! She had destroyed the dress. Nobody would be fooled by her ridiculous pretense at surprise at seeing the gown. Nesta had resented her from the first, and now her plans with Sowell were completely ruined. What was she going to do? Chapter 7. Holding back tears, Alary gathered up the pieces of her precious gown. Yellow slips of silk were everywhere. Nesta hadn't just cut it up. She had hurled scraps in every direction. How could she be so vicious? Alary sat on her bed, her arms full of bright scraps. The gown wasn't just torn, it was shredded. Not even the best seamstress could make this back into a dress, especially not in time for a ball in a few hours. How could she possibly fix this? Much as she had loved that yellow dress, and she would mourn its lost beauty for a long time, it represented something far greater. Without an appropriate ball gown, she would never be able to get into the ball. And if she couldn't get into the ball, Sowell couldn't choose her, couldn't marry her. It was sorely tempting to escape, to run from the palace into the woods, where she would sob her heart out in the little hut Sowell had built for her, the place she had begun to see as a representation of the home that she and Sowell would one day build together. But what good would that do? She would lose any opportunity to find a solution, to get to the ball anyway. She needed something to wear that wouldn't get her thrown out of the ball. Oh, if only it were a full costume ball! She could have done something with bedsheets and flowers from the field and maybe a useful stick, and been a shepherdess or a noble of ancient times. But that would never be accepted for a simple masked ball. There were ball gowns all over the palace, with so many women preparing at the palace. But short of stealing a dress, that didn't help her. Psst! Her door cracked open, and Alary spun in dismay to see Marin peeking in at the crack. "I came to see if you wanted your hair—" Marin's mouth dropped open at the sight of the yellow gown. "Alary, what happened?" Alary burst into tears. Embarrassed, she dug for a handkerchief to wipe them away, but in the next moment, Marin's handkerchief was in her hand, and Marin's arm was around her. Marin said nothing, but she reached out with her other hand to pick up one of the pieces of torn fabric. "Who did this?" Marin asked fiercely when Alary had finally managed to control her sobs. "The head maid," Alary whispered. "I think she thought Sowell and that we were having some sort of illicit relationship, and that I don't belong at the ball." She sat up, brushing at her face. "She's wrong. Sowell and I have always belonged together. It just took us a little while to realize it." "A little while?" Marin scoffed, laughing. "Very well. You need a new ball gown, and it just happens I might be able to do a little magic of my own. Come on." She grabbed Alary's hand and pulled her out into the hallway. They took a few steps at a rapid pace when Marin suddenly halted. "I was hoping to dramatically lead you to my room," she confessed, "but it occurs to me that it would be better if we didn't draw more attention than we need to. And you know the servants' corridors better than I do, despite all of my brother's games of hide-and-seek when we were children." Alary smiled at her and took the lead, tiptoeing down the servants' hallway until she reached the stairs, then leading them towards the royal wing through the secret passages. The servants' passageways did not all connect, so they occasionally had to use regular corridors and hope that nobody would be out wandering the halls instead of preparing for the ball. Whenever they did, Alary went first, Marin a few seconds later, and they walked down the hallway several paces apart, just in case they were spotted. Finally, they reached the servants' entrance to Marin's room. Alary turned to Marin, flushed with the success of their hurried jaunt through the castle, but Marin looked worried. "What's wrong?" Marin bit her lip. "My maid. She's a spy for my stepmother. I don't know that stepmother would care about your presence here, but she might. Or she might not be willing to keep it a secret." She tapped her chin. "Just a moment. Let me go in through the main door to my room. It's best if Gladys doesn't see me here. And send her on an errand. Can you find a place to hide so that she won't see you when she goes by? That will give us a few minutes." Alary agreed and continued down the servants' hallway. Since she was still dressed in her maid uniform, as long as she looked busy, nobody was likely to think anything of her. After a minute or two, the servants' door to Marin's room opened, and a disgruntled woman of middling years trotted out. She gave Alary barely a glance as she passed her and headed for the stairs. Just in case, Alary pretended to be on her way to another room until the older maid's head had disappeared down the staircase. "Marin?" she whispered as she entered. Come in, we have to hurry." Marin gestured to her bed. A gown the color of a summer sky was draped across the bed, almost shimmering in the late afternoon sunlight that streamed in through the windows. The bodice swooped and swirled with different shades of blue that danced around the neck and bodice. The skirt billowed in waves of blues, with sparkling clear beads giving it the look of stars just peeking out in an evening sky. "It's beautiful," Alary whispered. "But is it your gown?" "I have another gown for tonight." Marin made a face and gestured to a green dress that hung in her open dressing room. It was far simpler, with a high neck and waist and cap sleeves. "I'm not out yet, so stepmother says a girl's dress will do." Alary cocked her head. "Then this dress? It isn't yours?" "Oh, it is. It was meant to be my coming-out dress for next month." Alary's mouth dropped. "Oh, Marin, I can't take that." "Of course you can." Marin shook her head. "I'm too young to wear the dress today, but somehow in 1 month I'll be old enough? It's ridiculous. I'd far rather you have a beautiful dress for your wedding with Sowell than I have it for my coming-out ball. There's time for them to make another if it comes down to it. I want you to wear it." She glanced towards the dressing room door. "And you had better hurry. My maid will be back from her errands soon. I wish we could get ready together, though." She sounded wistful, and Alary wondered what it was like, growing up as a princess with 7 brothers and a stepmother. It must get lonely. There were no other girls who were on equal footing with Marin, and brothers were not exactly the same company that sisters were. She was so much younger that Alary had never thought of her as other than a child, Sawul's little sister, before. But she was 16 now, on the verge of adulthood, and what a fine woman and princess she was. On impulse, Alary threw her arms around Marin and hugged her tight. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything. And if things work out, I hope we can be like sisters." Marin's smile was almost tremulous. "I hope so too. Good luck." Alary risked folding the gown up as small as she could and wrapping it in cloth Marin tossed to her. Then she ducked into the servants' hallway and headed back to her room, careful to look as if she were on an important errand. Doing up the back of the dress was tricky, and Alary was half tempted to see if one of the other maids might have been sympathetic enough to help. But after Nesta, she didn't dare leave the room, especially as the door didn't lock, and she didn't dare trust any of the other maids not to tell Nesta or try to stop her themselves. Once she was dressed, she realized another challenge: how to do her hair. She had always had a maid do her hair for balls before. In the end, a simple twist would have to do, as it was the best she could do on herself. It was a little different from the basic bun she put her hair in as a maid, at least. Thankfully, Nesta's fury had been spent on the beautiful golden gown that Alary still mourned a little, even if she liked the blue just as much. The amount of effort that had gone into making the dress had been tremendous, and all of it wasted. But Nesta had not attempted to destroy the long gloves, mask, underclothing, or shoes that had been in the original package. They were not quite as perfect a match for the blue as they had been for the yellow, but they would do. Her eye caught on the bottle left on the pile of her servant's uniform, the little ash bottle she had been carrying around with her since she had discovered its magic. It would probably ruin the perfect lines of the dress, and there was always the risk of accidental breakage. And besides, she was marrying Sawul tonight. Nevertheless, her parents had been at the palace off and on since she had seen them, and they might find their way into the ball. She had to be prepared. And so she slipped the bottle into her pocket and tied it around her waist. Marin's dress didn't have a slit, so it would be challenging to reach it if she needed it. But at least it was there. At last, she was ready. And if she was right about the timing, she was a little early, and most of the guests would still be in their rooms preparing, the servants mostly attending them or helping out downstairs. The trickiest part was leaving her room. But Nesta was not lying in wait, and Alary was able to make it quickly to the stairs and down to the first corridor a guest would likely be walking down. Now she took on the confident, strolling stride of the invited guest, who was in no rush to reach the ballroom. Her casual strides hid her inner anxiety. What if her parents caught sight of her? She had donned her mask while still in her room, but they were her parents after all. If they came across her alone in a corridor, would they be able to recognize her by the way she moved, her voice, and what they could see of her features? Likely, they could. She practically held her breath every time she passed a group of people or a door opened near her, the corridors gradually filling with people. She went against the stream as she neared the entrance to the palace. As most people streamed in, she slipped by them against the edge of the great doors and out into the warm summer night's air. If anybody noticed the girl walking towards the parade of carriages instead of away, they likely assumed she was returning to fetch something she had forgotten in her carriage. But most of them had no attention at all for anything except the bright lights of the palace before them. Finally, Alary turned and entered the line and allowed herself to be nudged along until she reached the palace. She made sure to stand near a large family with similar clothing to hers as she entered, walking just behind and slightly next to the youngest daughter. The palace guards allowed her in without batting an eye, or asking for her identity, which she hoped to conceal for just a little longer. Glittering with candles and a dramatic chandelier, the ballroom was as sparkling and welcome as Aleri had ever seen it. There was a fervor in the air, and how the people, especially mothers and their eligible daughters, spoke with excitement and looked towards the princes. Word had gotten out then that the prince intended to choose a bride at the ball. Had Sawol succeeded in convincing a cleric or priest to perform the ceremony for them? She hadn't been able to contact him to discover if their plan had a chance, or was doomed to fail from the start. Most of Sawol's brothers, except the youngest ones, stood in the receiving line with the king and queen. Aleri bit her lip as she found herself in the line approaching. Did she dare go through the receiving line? It would be an opportunity to catch Sawol's eye, so that he would be able to find her later. But what if the king and queen reacted to seeing her? If her parents were nearby, it would be all they needed. Taking a few steps closer to the front of the line, she watched Sawol return a diplomat's bow. He looked up just as Aleri took a step closer, and his eyes caught on Aleri's. He froze. She smiled in greeting, and a moment later, an answering smile lit up his face. His eyes flicked towards the ball, and she nodded, accepting his hint for what it was. He knew she was there, and now that he had seen her gown, he would hopefully be able to pick her out at the ball. Even that momentary glance would be enough, as she knew he had been trained to recognize people and clothing quickly as a prince. But she hadn't. Would such memorization be expected of a princess? Would his parents be displeased at his marriage to someone who had not been raised to know diplomacy in the way their son had? Aleri shook her head, banishing the thought. If his parents were encouraging him to look at all of the noble girls, she was on equal footing with the rest. She was an earl's daughter, after all, and her education had been comparable to other girls of her station. Either she would learn the skill if necessary, or she would make do without it. Or make Sawol whisper the names of all the people she met. The thought of standing next to Sawol during dull diplomatic events, whispering to each other to keep from perishing of boredom, thrilled her. She and Sawol would be partners, and their work would be lighter and pleasanter because it was shared. It was best to avoid drawing attention too early on in the ball, so Aleri tried her best to blend in and act as she would at any ball. She accepted a few dance partners and even enjoyed it a little, although always she looked to see where Sawol was whenever a partner relinquished her hand. Panting from the exertion of her last dance, a quick one called the Gwanwyn Latcher, she ducked into a corner behind a column and scanned the room for Sawol's deep blue coat. He wasn't leading a lady to the floor for the current dance, nor did she see him with the onlookers. A quick peek at the head of the room, where the king and queen greeted others and watched the dance, showed that he wasn't there either. "Miss me?" asked a deep voice from behind her. Chapter 8. Sawol grinned as Aleri let out a little squeal as she whirled almost into his arms. He caught her hands and indulged in a quick kiss to the back of each before releasing them. "How was the ball?" he asked quietly. He had seen her dance several times, twice while he was dancing with other partners. It was uncomfortable to see her holding other men's hands even for the brief twists and twirls of the dance, but it was just as uncomfortable to make friendly conversation and dance with his own partners. In a mere hour, this foolish game would be over, and he and Aleri would be standing together before the cleric he'd found. Father Michael had been puzzled but willing when he was told of Aleri's noble parentage and the king's approval of a wedding. Sawol might have exaggerated his father's pleasure to see a son wed, but he didn't think his father would deny the wedding once it began. "Would you like to take in the evening air?" he asked, nodding towards a nearby balcony. Aleri agreed eagerly. The cooler night air felt refreshing after the heat of hundreds of bodies in the ballroom. If only they could stay out here until the announcement and wedding. "I don't think we'll be able to hide for long," he said reluctantly. "There are too many people watching me and eager for a dance, or for me to dance with their daughters." Aleri squeezed his hand. "Only for a little while longer." Tentatively, Sowell touched the glimmering fabric of Illyri's dress at the waist. The skirt of the dress poofed out, not unlike the other ladies at the ball, but he loved the tiny glittering sparkles in it that reminded him of stars. "This isn't the dress you were going to wear, was it? Marin told me to look for you in yellow." In that next moment, he realized how that had sounded. "Not that I don't love this dress. The blue is amazing. There was no simple way to say that he didn't think she had access to a second dress. And surely Marin would have known the color, and she would have no reason to mislead him. Illyri looked away. "It was destroyed." "Destroyed? How?" She took a visible breath. "The head maid. She hates me. She saw the two of us together and thinks that we have some sort of illicit relationship. When she saw the dress and I suppose realized that I was going to the ball, she destroyed it." She bit her lip. "Well, I didn't see her do it, but from what she said, I'm sure it was her." Sowell fought to tamp down his fury. How dare she? "I'll have her dismissed immediately." It wasn't enough to appease the anger that coursed through his veins. Marin had told him how excited Illyri had been about that dress, and he could imagine the heartbreak she must have discovered at its destruction, and all while he was completely unaware. Righteous indignation made him want to lash out and destroy something of that maid's, but dismissing her was the most he could do. "Dismissed?" Illyri's voice trailed off. "She deserves it," he said, his jaw stiff as he tried to keep his voice controlled. Illyri did not respond for a moment, and he touched a hand to her chin, raising her face to meet his. "She deserves it," he said again. Illyri blinked, then nodded. Her eyes cleared. "You're right. Part of me wants to protest, to say that she shouldn't lose her job over this, but she should. If she truly thought I was doing something wrong, she could have spoken to me directly about it, or brought it to the housekeeper or butler, or dismissed me, or even just left well enough alone since she didn't actually know anything. But instead, she did the cruelest thing she could imagine and took pleasure in it. It calls her character and her leadership into question. I can't be the only person she's taken it upon herself to knock down a peg. Besides, as she said when I first reported to her, there are many more deserving people vying for palace positions." "That's my girl," Sowell said, his own rage lessening as Illyri's voice grew stronger. "I'll speak with the butler tomorrow." He paused at a sudden pleasant thought. "In fact, by tomorrow we'll be married. You could speak with the butler if you liked." Illyri giggled, and Sowell felt the last of his anger fade away. "Where did you get this dress, then?" "Marin was my fairy godmother, twice over, it seems. This was meant to be the gown she would wear for her presentation, but she gave it to me instead. She is the dearest girl in all the world, you know. You're lucky to have her." "I am." But his sister was the last person he wanted to think about just now, alone with Illyri, her eyes shining with happiness as she looked up at him. As if she could read his mind, Illyri took a step closer to him and lightly touched his chest. "She was my hero, and now I'm here, at your beautiful ball, and we're both in our best, well, in my case, Marin's best, clothes, and tonight, we're going to get married." She tilted her face up towards him, and Sowell answered her unspoken request. He kissed her, softly at first, thrilling in the sensation of holding her in his arms at last. They fit together as if they had been made for each other. Her arms tightened around him, and he smiled against her mouth, delighting in how perfect and natural kissing Illyri seemed, as if he had been born for that very thing. "On the balcony, I think," a voice said somewhere nearby, and Sowell reluctantly released Illyri and took a step back. "I think we're about to be discovered," he said softly. Illyri nodded and sidled back into the shadows. "I'll wait here for a few minutes," she said. "Enjoy the evening. Just not too much." He grinned. "I'll miss you every moment. See you at midnight." He would have to dance at least a few more dances to keep his parents happy and the guests from complaining. But come midnight, he could probably avoid ever dancing with anyone who wasn't a Larry again. "Would you like a drink?" A Larry looked up at the waiter, momentarily grateful. She had danced twice after leaving the balcony, but midnight now loomed, and she was too anxious, her stomach churning, to bear another dance with a stranger. Or worse, with someone she knew from her time at the palace, for she sometimes recognized people by their chins or their eyes or their posture, and there was always the fear that they, too, might recognize her. Unfortunately, the waiter's tray was full of strong alcoholic drinks, and Larry didn't dare risk compromising her balance or attentiveness. He was holding one out to her, raising his eyebrows. "No, thank you." The waiter frowned. But he looked across the room, and Larry followed his gaze, although with a sudden sinking sensation. She knew exactly whom she would see. Her parents were halfway across the room. Father was in conversation with a group of men, and Mother stood with an elderly couple. But as Larry watched, Mother looked up, caught Larry watching, and looked away again. They knew she was here. "Here," the waiter said, thrusting the glass into Larry's hand before she could decline and disappearing into the crowd. Larry looked dubiously down into the glass, then towards her parents. She froze when she realized they were gone. Had they sent the waiter over? If so, then there was absolutely no way she was drinking this. And where had they gone? Not knowing was worse than even seeing them had been. She spun in place, but they were nowhere to be seen in the shifting crowd. "Oh, thanks," she heard a voice say, and suddenly the glass was out of her hands. Startled, Larry looked up to see Sowell downing the drink, head thrown back. She gasped, but he was handing it back to her before she could say anything. "It's almost midnight," he said, clearing his throat. "It's time for the announcement. Be ready." He gave her hand a quick squeeze, and then was off to the front of the room, where his father and stepmother stood. "Sowell!" Larry started forward towards him, but her motion was immediately blocked by the crowd, which was moving forward and closing in as they sensed the time for the announcement had come. What had been in that drink? Her stomach twisted with fear as she tried to push towards him, but was shoved back. The king tapped his staff twice on the floor, and the crowd noises finally died down. "Ladies and gentlemen, my son has an announcement to make." The king stepped back, nodding to Sowell, who took his place at the front. "First, I want to—" he coughed. "To thank all of you for—" Sowell's eyes opened wide with horror, and he suddenly clutched at his throat. "The prince!" someone shouted, and then Sowell's brother Rain was pounding on his back, while one of his younger brothers called for a physician. A heavy hand clamped over Larry's mouth, and before she could cry out, she was being pulled backwards through a crowd who were too shocked by the second prince's apparent choking to notice a girl being carried off. Larry kicked frantically, but her father had thrown his other arm around her throat, and suddenly there was no air. She pulled frantically at his arm, but couldn't dislodge it, and her entire world narrowed to the pain in her neck and the desperate, aching, consuming need to breathe. Blackness was closing in around her when suddenly the pressure at her throat eased, and she could take in a gasping breath. Stumbling, she barely caught herself before she tumbled down the steps of one of the palace's entrances. "It's here," Mother said, and before Larry had managed more than a few frantic breaths of cool, clear air, her father had her again and was dragging her down the steps and into a carriage that awaited. She had enough breath to cry out just as the carriage door opened, but Mother pulled her in, while Father pushed, and the door was shut before her scream reached full pitch. "Good night, dear," Mother said, holding a cloth towards her that smelled strangely sweet. Chapter 9. Gagging, Sowell dropped to his knees as the crowd broke into cacophony around him, but he was up in a minute, taking long breaths to calm down. He could breathe, but something was wrong with his throat. No, his voice. He stood just in time to see Alary being dragged from the room by her parents, who had taken advantage of the crowd's distraction to kidnap her in front of everyone, without a question. Pointing to Alary, he tried to call for guards, but he could do nothing but utter a weak squawk.
"Sowell, what's going on?"
Father's tone was not asking, but demanding.
"Are you ill?"
"He must be," Rain said, stepping back. The pounding he had given Sowell's back, presumably thinking he was choking, had left Sowell aching, but he couldn't think of that now. Gesturing wildly to his father that he was going after Alary, Sowell bolted for the back doors behind the dais. Thankful that he was a prince and had access to the private royal entrances and exits from the rooms, as he would otherwise have never made it through the crowd in time, he bolted for the stables. Her parents must have planned this. That drink. Now that he thought of it, Alary had looked dismayed when he drank it, and mere moments later, her parents were dragging her from the room. They must have planned this, and there had to have been something in the drink to... what? Keep her from crying out? He should have realized that they would guess Alary would attend the ball. They would have a carriage waiting. With something this planned, they would be off with Alary the moment they left the door, and likely the carriage would be bound for Karnovka immediately. Whether they would escort her the entire way themselves, or whether they would leave the carriage at some defined point, he didn't know, although if he didn't catch up quickly, that might be a vulnerability he could use. There was no time to saddle a horse, so it would have to be bareback. He winced at the thought. Hariel was his fastest horse, but he was excitable. If Sowell had to do any maneuvering to rescue Alary, how did one rescue someone from a moving carriage? It would be better to bring Fainwin. She was quick and dependable and very responsive, and she had a smooth canter, which might make her fractionally easier to ride bareback. He hoped. Fainwin sensed Sowell's excitement and danced around a little as he led her to a block. Riding bareback, he would need it to mount. He threw himself over her back inelegantly and squeezed his calves against her ribs, clucking to hurry her along. Light poured from all the windows of the palace, and for a little while, Sowell could see the road clearly enough. But as he kicked Fainwin into a canter, they passed beyond the lighted areas near the castle, and were left with only the full moon to light their way. He raced through the sparse trees along the palace road as quickly as he dared in the moonlight, and while clinging on bareback. But even without daring a full gallop, it wasn't long before he could see the shadow of a carriage in the distance. Doubt made his stomach churn. What was he going to do when he caught up? Her parents would no doubt protest, and he had no real justification for stopping them. She was still a minor. But he had promised her he would ride after her to Karnovka if that was what it took, and he would not fail her. The carriage was just ahead, and without letting himself wallow further in indecision, he urged Fainwin onwards. She balked as they pulled even with the carriage, breaking her stride momentarily, and he almost lost his grip and went flying. No wonder man had invented saddles and bridles. Fainwin did not care to run alongside other horses. "Alary!" he cried, his voice still raspy and weak, but the shades were drawn on the window nearest him. He urged Fainwin onwards, and she slowly moved ahead until she was alongside the carriage horses. The coachman's eyes widened in shock when he saw Sowell, and he flicked the reins to urge the horses faster, gesturing furiously at Sowell to get away from the horses. Kicking his horse to keep up, Sowell adjusted his grip and prepared to stop the coach by any means necessary. He reached an arm out shakily to grasp at the nearest horse's harness, but missed. Fainwin did not like his leaning to the left, though, and she shifted to the right, too far away for him to reach. For a moment, he allowed her to find her stride and calm down before he tried to reach again. Still, Fainwin was just a little too far, and he couldn't reach. He'd caught a runaway horse this way once, but he'd been in the saddle, and the runaway horse had had flying reins. This was far more challenging. Movement caught his eye, and he looked up to see the driver staring at him in confusion and dismay. Was he a willing partner with the Earl and Countess? If not, why didn't he stop when he recognized his prince? Suddenly, realization hit Sowell, and he twisted in the saddle so that the coachman could get a full view of his royal garb. The coachman's eyes dropped to his chest, and he blanched, then gave Sowell an awkward half-bow. "Stop the carriage!" Sowell shouted desperately, thrusting out a flat hand in a halt gesture. Although his powers of speech seemed to be returning, his voice still disappeared into the pounding of hooves and rumbling of carriage wheels, but his hand motion had been clear enough. The driver nodded and pulled on the reins, and the horses began to slow. It was an agonizingly long time before the carriage finally neared a stop. Fainwin willingly slowed while keeping pace with the other horses, for which he was grateful. He didn't even wait until the carriage had completely stopped before he halted her and practically vaulted from her back. What were Alari's parents doing to her? They had to have felt the carriage slow. Would they hurt her in the time it had taken to stop the carriage? The carriage was still moving slightly, so he had to jog alongside it until he could yank on the door just as it finally stopped and rocked back. To his astonishment, Alari leaped out from the carriage, one hand holding the edge of her dress to her face, the other reaching for him. Before he could react, she had tackled him to the ground and covered his mouth and nose with her hand. He couldn't breathe. He fought against rising panic and the urge to shove her off, but her eyes were on him, serious and urgent. There was a reason for this, and he would trust her. Turning away from him, she looked towards the carriage and lowered her dress from her face. A few moments later, she released him, and he gasped for breath. "What was that?" he asked. In answer, Alari scrambled to her feet and gestured at the carriage behind her. The door swung open, and he could just see Alari's parents, both lying slumped on their seats. "What? I have finally," Alari said, breathing hard, "vanquished the ogres." Chapter 10. Alari grinned. Sowell's stunned expression as he looked beyond her into the carriage was a sight to behold. "Vanquished?" he repeated in confusion. His voice sounded rough. What had that drink done to him? "Hadn't we better return to the palace? And our wedding?" Alari gestured to his horse. "Do you think Fainwin would carry two?" Although she wore no saddle. Well, perhaps that would be best. If the horse was saddled, Alari would inevitably end up on the edge of the saddle, or something of that sort, which would be horribly uncomfortable. Even bareback was better than that. Yes," Sowell said. He wiped the befuddled look off his face before offering Alari a boost onto the horse's back. Her ball gown was not exactly meant to be worn on a horse, so Alari could either ride in a strange sort of bareback side saddle, or she could hitch her dress up to the point of ridiculousness and let it poof out over the horse, bearing her legs to the thigh. It was utterly scandalous, but then Alari was on her way to her wedding, and nobody would see her but Sowell. Well, and perhaps the driver. Sowell stroked a finger down her bare left foot. "You're missing a shoe." "It fell off as they dragged me from the palace." She would have to make sure to retrieve it, as Marin might wish to have her shoes back. Sowell led the horse to the edge of the woods, Alari clinging to the mane for dearest life. Even astride, every move felt likely to tip her over the side without saddle or bridle.
"What is all this now?" the coachman called after them. "Who is that girl? I beg your pardon, your highness, But my passengers are an earl and countess, after all, and I mean to see to their safety. Then do so by all means, Sowell called back. His voice sounded stronger, with only a hint of the roughness she had heard before. But I'll be taking this girl along with me. In about half an hour, she will be my wife. The coachman's jaw dropped. Just in case he had any concerns about whether Sowell spoke the truth, O'Leary spoke up. All is well, but please take my parents back to their estate. I believe they will be there for some time. Sowell had found what he was looking for, a thick branch that lay sideways in the brush near the road. He turned Fainwin and used the branch as a mounting block, awkwardly landing behind O'Leary. It was all she could do not to be knocked off as he found his place. But finally, his arms were wrapped around her and also tangled in Fainwin's mane, and they were on their way home. Now, he said, leaning so close that his breath warmed her ear, you have to tell me just how you vanquished those ogres. I'm assuming they are actually still alive? Very much so, she assured him. She wrapped one of her hands around his, and he shifted it so that they were both holding hands and the mane at the same time. My mother, she explained, had some sort of cloth she tried to place over my face. It smelled like some sort of herbs, very sweet, and I knew. She swallowed, remembering the moment of absolute panic as that cloth had neared her face. I knew if she got it on me, it would be over. Sowell's arms tightened around her for a moment in almost a hug. But she didn't. Well, it seems the muscles I have been developing from cleaning all those fireplace grates every day are of some use after all. Father had sat back in his seat, assuming I would be unable to resist. It took very little effort to wrest the cloth away from Mother. And then, she blushed. Well, I had a weapon of my own, although it was a challenge to fight both of them off until I could retrieve it. Fortunately, Father is not an active sort of man. A knife? She giggled. No. Some weeks ago, when I was cleaning a fireplace in the court enchanter's room, I fell asleep. Being a maid must have been exhausting, Sowell said with sympathy. It was, but that was not the reason why. I woke perhaps quarter of an hour later to find the head maid standing over me. She ordered me back to work, but as soon as I began to clean the grate again, we both fell asleep. There was something in the enchanter's fireplace, Sowell guessed. She nodded. Some herbs in the ashes. When I figured out how to safely clean it, I bottled a little in case I ever had to put someone to sleep quickly. And it seems it worked. Letting out a bark of laughter, Sowell hugged her again. That's my ogre hunter. She shivered momentarily. If her mother's cloth had gone over her own face, what would it have done to her? Would it have put her to sleep? Sowell might still have stopped the carriage, but what then? He had no grounds to demand that her parents hand her over. He could have tried to take her by force, but could he have done so without a weapon? Would the driver have sided with him if her parents were awake and able to protest? Hey, Sowell whispered against her neck. You're here with me now, and in a few minutes, we'll be at the palace, and Fainwin can enjoy some well-earned treats in the stable. And you, my dear, will be joining me for the most and least expected wedding the royals have ever known. Most and least? Suddenly, O'Leary felt close to tears, her brain too slow to follow. Well, I'm sure many older folks watched us play together as children and speculated on our future, don't you think? We never paid them much attention, but I would hear the rumors from time to time. But nobody was expecting a wedding at this ball. The palace had come into view, and Sowell let the horses walk slow to applaud. 10 minutes ago, I thought we'd lost, he whispered. I thought your parents would take you away to Karnovka, and I'd never see you again. But then you rode to my rescue on a horse, and stopped the carriage like a hero of old.
O'Leary whispered back. The flickering torchlight outside the palace made everything seem dreamy and soft, and she blinked away the tears that threatened to fall. He chuckled. When I said I would ride after you to Karnovka to stop your carriage, I thought it was an exaggeration. Who knew that I'd have to stand by my words? Although stopping your carriage is about all you needed me for, considering you took the ogres out yourself. I'm not sure what I would have done if you hadn't stopped it. I had to hold my dress over my nose and mouth, so I didn't succumb to sleep as well, and I couldn't exactly have done that while shoving them out of a moving carriage. And I knew it only worked for perhaps a quarter of an hour. Amusing as the idea of watching her parents tumble from the carriage was, she didn't know if she could have brought herself to do it. What if they had been caught up in the wheels and killed? I suppose that's why you landed on me and tried to suffocate me in such a dramatic fashion. I didn't know how fast it would dissipate once the carriage door was open, and I didn't want you to fall asleep too. I would never have managed to get a great lug like you on a horse. The coachman might have helped, Sowell said with a grin. He hoped the man had listened to his advice and taken the pair back to their estate. I don't know whether the coachman was working with them, so I don't know that I would have dared simply tap on the roof for him to stop. Thank goodness your parents didn't get much beyond the palace grounds. Otherwise, I'm not sure my legs or spine could have handled Fainwin's back for that long. They couldn't have arranged things better, O'Leary said wryly. Squeezing their clasped arms, he nodded. Then she felt him press a kiss against her head. 10 years ago, we first set out to find fairies and fight ogres. And at last, our mission is complete. Your parents will awaken eventually, but by then you'll be my wife and under the protection of the crown. And look. He gestured to the edge of the wood nearest the palace, which stood out in darkness against the torchlight of the palace grounds. But it wasn't truly dark. As she watched, little sparks of light appeared and disappeared along the edge of the trees. Fireflies, she whispered, as close to fairies as I can imagine. They veered around the side of the palace as they headed for the stables, and O'Leary watched the appearing and disappearing lights as they went. A sleepy groom came out to take Fainwin in hand, assuring Sowell that he would reward her for her hard midnight ride. As Sowell lifted O'Leary down from the horse, she balanced awkwardly on one foot. She should have known Sowell would notice. I'd almost forgotten about your shoe, he said, holding out his hand. Come, I'll carry you to the palace entrance. Before she could protest, he had scooped her into his arms. You can pretend I'm carrying you over the threshold. O'Leary grinned and leaned her head back against Sowell's chest as he walked from the royal stable to the palace entrance. I could get used to this. His chest rumbled as he laughed. Taking to royal life already, I see. Shall I hire you a salon chair and 4 strapping young men to carry you about everywhere you go? You're carrying me easily enough. You think you're worth 4 strapping young men? He set her down on the palace stairs and pretended to gasp for air. It might take at least 4 to do this regularly. Laughing, she went to grab her shoe, but he dropped the act and dove for it first. Do you know any girls who might fit this shoe? He asked, holding it up. I promised to marry the girl it fits. He wiggled the shoe enticingly. O'Leary shook her head sadly. No, I'm afraid I don't. Sowell cocked his head, his brow furrowed. I don't quite fit the shoes. They are your sister's, after all. They're a bit large on me. I suppose that's why you lost it. Well, do you think it will stay on long enough for a dance? Once we're wed, I'll expect a first dance, you know. O'Leary slipped her foot into the shoe and then accepted Sowell's hand to pull her to her feet. Taking his arm, she walked with him towards the palace doors. It was time for a wedding at last. Sowell and O'Leary entered the ballroom to chaos. There was no music and no dancing, and he could see his father and brothers arguing on the dais. Marin, the only one who could have any reasonable understanding of what was going on, stood at the edge of the group, staring out over the crowd and wringing her hands. She was the first to see him, and he could see her face light up.
"Prince Saul!"
A nobleman near his father's age exclaimed, grabbing Saul's arm.
"What was all that? You start to make an announcement, and the next moment—"
"Prince Saul!" cried a wealthy businesswoman, stopping in her tracks the moment she saw him. The shouts caught the attention of the other guests, and before Saul knew it, he and Alary were being mobbed. He threw an arm around Alary and pulled her to his side so they would not be separated, and he noted with satisfaction that she put her arm around his waist.
"Saul!"
It was Rain, forcing himself through the crowd in front of him. Recognizing their crown prince, people parted, allowing him to reach Saul. The moment he did, he grabbed hard onto Saul's wrist and pulled him forward. Amused, Saul kept a tight grip around Alary and allowed himself to be dragged up to the dais with the rest of his family. The crowd wouldn't part for anyone but their king or crown prince, so he would let his bossy older brother take the lead on this one. When they reached the dais, Saul handed Alary up before joining her. The first thing he did was to hug Marin tightly. "Well done, sis," he whispered, before moving to join his father. The look of bewilderment and irritation on his father's face was a sight to behold. Father did not like surprises and did not like to feel out of control. Unfortunately, he would continue to experience both this evening. Next to Father stood a priest, looking only slightly less confused than the king did. Thank goodness he had his voice back, otherwise this would have been more challenging than he'd like. "Attention!" he called, and the shouts and cries lowered to whispers and murmurs. When he deemed the susurrus reduced enough, he gave the speech he had been preparing before Alary's parents had begun their fiendish plans. "You were all invited tonight to a ball in which I met many of the most eligible young ladies in the kingdom. I am honored at your presence and have enjoyed dancing with many of you. I wish to announce that I have chosen my bride, Lady Alary, daughter of Lord and Lady Royader." It was galling to give them the credit of announcing their names, but it would be remarked upon if he did not. There were groans and cheers from the crowd, as well as several gasps and a "well done" from his brothers, and Saul held up his hand and waited for the noise to die down before continuing. "Lady Alary has graciously accepted my proposal, so I wish to share with you a little treat. You are also invited to witness our wedding. Father Michael will begin the ceremony in just a moment." The moment he stepped back, his father was at his side.
"Lady Alary, is it?"
He looked from one to the other.
"Well, I suppose I should have guessed things would go that way. You couldn't give your old father a hint, eh?"
Saul chuckled, but then the queen moved to her husband's side.
"Oh, Arno, they're far too young to marry. Surely you will not condone this. They could enter into an engagement and marry in perhaps a few years."
Just why was Queen Shined so determined to keep him from marrying? If he were an only son, he could perhaps see that she hoped to have her own future sons high in the line of succession. But Father had 7 sons. Even Lou, the youngest, had no real likelihood of ever taking the throne. Was it attention that concerned her? Not wanting the king to have grandchildren who would compete with her own children for attention? That was possible, perhaps. But what was not possible was postponing the wedding. Alary would still be in danger from her parents until she married, and whatever herbs they had used on that cloth would not keep them away forever. "I have chosen my bride, as I promised you," he said to his father. "Father Michael is ready to marry us, and He gestured behind him to the crowd, who were still milling about and chattering, but this time with an air of excitement and anticipation. The people are looking forward to a wedding.
And we shall give them one.
Father took Saul's hand and kissed Alari's cheeks.
Welcome to the family, my dear.
Then he turned to the crowd and held up his hands for silence.
Let the wedding festivities begin.
Alari couldn't take her eyes off Saul for the wedding ceremony. His were bright, sometimes almost a little teary, and filled with the same emotion as hers no doubt were. Love. It had been years in the making, but somehow it had still taken her by surprise. And now she would grasp it with 2 hands, because the bond between her and Saul would only strengthen as the years passed. She was determined. Despite the intense joy that kept her smiling as she made her vows to her new husband, a small part of her was too anxious to indulge in complete happiness. Her parents had been knocked out by the herb in that cloth, but without knowing what it was, she didn't know how long they would be unconscious, nor if the coachman would take them home as she suggested. But to her relief, the ceremony continued without interruption until it reached the best part.
You may now share your first kiss as wedded couple,
the priest concluded, and Saul turned to Alari with a broad smile that split his face. Safe at last. She laughed a little in relief as she stepped closer to her husband. Husband. What a lovely word that was. From partners in mischief to partners in life, from friends to lovers, they had found each other and their place in the world. Saul cradled her head in one large palm as he tilted her face up to meet his gaze. My darling wife, he whispered huskily. She smiled. My adored husband. And then his lips were on hers, somehow soft and yet firm, sweet and yet demanding. It was perfect. All too soon it was over, and a roar went up from the crowd as they turned to face their people.
Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to present for the very first time, Princess Alari.
Alari blushed as the massive ballroom filled with applause and cheers, and she was grateful for the arm Saul slipped around her back. In a moment, everybody and their cousin is going to surge forward to congratulate us, Saul whispered in her ear. But I have a better idea. May I have this dance? At her pleased nod, he called to the musicians, who had been sitting back and watching the spectacle. Musicians, if you would do us the honor, we would like to lead the company in our first dance. The Kupel Mayan Karyat, if you will. She smiled and handed Marin the lovely bouquet she had clutched through the ceremony. It had been Marin herself who had slipped a coin to a maid to gather the beautiful blooms so that Alari would have a wedding posy. Thank you, Marin, Alari said softly, for everything. Marin squeezed her hands as she took the flowers. You're welcome, dear sister. Alari blinked and impulsively threw an arm around Marin, squeezing her tight before turning back to Saul. They joined the other couples who had taken to the floor, taking the lead position. When the first strains of music began, Saul bowed, Alari curtsied, and the dance began. Saul had chosen well. The Kupel Mayan Karyat dance kept a couple together for most of the dance, swirling around each other in beautiful spins. Now that Alari was safely married, she could enjoy it fully. Saul's eyes were on hers as they spun together and apart, and Alari found herself oddly on the point of laughter. Not laughter at something so amusing, but because of the sheer delight of whirling about the room with Saul, her husband, and not a care in the world. The dance was almost over before she chanced a glance at the king and queen and almost missed a step. Her parents were speaking with Saul's parents, and they looked furious. She looked quickly back at Saul, but he had already followed her gaze, and his own darkened. He nodded, But they finished the dance, even though all of the joy was lost. As soon as the music stopped, he offered her his arm and they crossed to the dais, where her parents stood before the king and queen.
"Ah, here they are,"
King Arnal said, his voice somber. Alari's parents spun around to see Alari standing behind them. "Alari, what have you done?" Mother demanded.
"You can't marry as a minor without my permission. It's invalid."
Father shook a finger at Alari.
"I gave them permission,"
the king said. The look he gave Saul made it clear that her poor husband was going to have to face his father later. But he went on.
"The marriage is valid." "But—"
Father looked stymied.
"We had a trade deal. Part of the deal was the requirement to send Alari to be part of their court. I'm sure Roscra will understand," the king said. "Or is it Ashendun?"
They planned to send her to Karnovka. Saul's arm was around Alari's back again, and he stroked her softly, reassuringly.
"Karnovka?"
King Arnal's displeasure was clear.
"With their tariffs? We'll need to arrange a discussion, I think. I'd be very interested in the nature of this deal. But in the meantime, we'll let the happy bride and groom return to their wedding dances."
His voice allowed for no dispute, and Alari thrilled to see her parents sag with dismay. Music was beginning again, and Alari allowed Saul to lead her back into the dance. This time, she could let her spirits soar with impunity. She was married. The king upheld it, and nothing could ever separate her from Saul again. Epilogue. Alari jolted awake at the sound of a clatter at the window. Puzzled, she rolled over in bed to face Saul, but he was gone. Smiling, Alari sat upright. Had he really thrown stones at their shared window? What in the world could he be up to? Throwing open the window, she looked down. Their new shared chambers were only 3 stories up. 2 if you were standing on the entrance stairs as Saul was now. "Alari," he called. "Come down and see. The fairies are dancing." With delight, Alari pulled a robe over her nightgown and slipped through the servants' passages she knew so well, racing downstairs on stocking feet with her shoes in her hands so that she didn't rouse anyone. When she reached the small side entrance where she'd seen Saul, he was no longer there. He was on the grassy lawn facing towards the pond and the woods where they had spent so many of their days, both as children and adults. "Look," he whispered as she joined him and slipped her arm through his. "Fairies." Fireflies were winking in and out all through the trees and along the edge of the pond. Sighing happily, Alari leaned her head against Saul's shoulder. They had spent countless hours catching the fairies as children, but now they most reminded her of seeing them upon their return to the palace after Saul had rescued her. They're still magical. And they were. Crickets chirped and marsh frogs croaked, and a loon called in the distance. The marshy pond and the woods were alive with wonder, and the fairies lit it all. Saul ran a hand down her arm and caught her hand in his. "Do you want me to catch one for you?" Alari shook her head. "Sometimes it's more beautiful just to watch them in the distance. Holding them in one's hand, they don't seem quite as magical." "Just don't follow them into the bog," he joked. "It might not drown you, but getting soaked would ruin the magic just the same." She hadn't planned it, but somehow the moment seemed right. "You know, there's another bit of magic tonight as well." "Oh?" She moved his hand onto her stomach, still flat now, but not for long. "I know they say a woman shouldn't tell her husband until she's felt the quickening, but I've never been able to keep a secret from you." Saul's hand jerked in hers, and then he spun around to face her, eyes glowing in the light from the palace torches. "Alari, you mean—" We're going to have a baby? It will be some time before we know for sure. I've only begun to suspect. But even if it's only a maybe, I can't keep it to myself. I'm glad you didn't. He hugged her tight. I'd rather wait and hope with you. And if it's not, well, then I'm sure it will happen soon. He let go suddenly. Oh, I'm not going to hurt the baby, am I? She laughed. Hug me all you want. His warmth was welcome as the night was growing cooler. Summer was nearing an end, and it was likely that this was the last time they would see fireflies for the year. Next summer, she might have a sweet baby boy or girl to introduce to the fairies. This was perfect. Thank you for waking me. He chuckled softly. Thank you for waking me on that night months ago. If you hadn't, I wouldn't have this happiness now. It's our own fairy story. The imaginary fairies flitted through the trees, and Larry remembered the vanquished ogres, who had been sent back to their estate in disgrace once the king had got wind of the details of their trade deal. In some ways, the fantasy world they had invented as children had come true. Then this, Sowell said, kissing her forehead, is our happily ever after. I hope you enjoyed listening to Unmasked Part 2 by Sarah Carlisle, narrated by Karyne Norton. If you want to read more by Sarah, go to author-sarahcarlisle.com, where you can snag the ebook copy of Unmasked for free. Make sure you also check out her other fairy tale retellings while you're there. You just have a few more days to enter the Fantasy Retelling audiobook giveaway, with books from Marissa Meyer, Joanna Ruth Myers, Melanie Sellier, and Kara Swanson, as well as a 3-month Audible subscription. Go to findingfantasyreads.com/giveaway to enter. Don't forget there's a Finding Fantasy Reads newsletter with weekly reminders for the podcast episodes, plus book deals, new releases, and anything else that I think might interest someone who enjoys fantasy audiobooks and short stories. You can sign up for that by going to findingfantasyreads.com/newsletter, but I'll also have links in the show notes. Thanks so much for listening, and happy reading.